So I'm just gonna kind of just like generally answer your question, basically for the audience, for people who aren't listening before, or and people who just tuned in now, so that they can kind of understand kind of where we're coming from. And I'll just kind of lay out the link between Jesus, Judaism, and the whole thing. Okay. So from our perspective, you know, essentially, this ancient religion ran by the Jewish priest class in Judea around Jerusalem basically cooked up an ethnic version of their own myth, basically into a national epic that we now know today as like the Hebrew Bible. They cooked up this book and they used it as a sort of like a psyop on their own people to get their own people to behave in a certain way that they wanted to them to behave. And it's basically like the ancient version of, mind control or like a psyop. In the same way the elites or the powerful today manipulate and control society through ideas and stories and marketing and advertising and everything else and politics, all that stuff. The very ancient version of this was essentially what we now like talk about as like religion. And the Jewish religion, Judaism, Yahwehism, basically came out of a specific pantheon, like the Canaanite pantheon, where they're worshiping Yahweh, a lesser deity, and they choose him. They're henotheistic, right? So it's a not a monotheistic, but a henotheistic, where there's many gods, but that God chose them. And essentially, over time, this religion developed and developed into what we would call like Judaism or proto-Judaism or all this other stuff. Okay. And part of the prophecies, right? So part of that's religion is, the circumcision, the celebrating things like Passover and all these other holidays, right? And what they do in this religion and what their goal is to fulfill these prophecies, right? And those prophecies basically go kind of like this. One day, a military conqueror will come, sent by God, and he will fulfill a bunch of these prophecies. He will be of the line of David, and some say Solomon, and that he will basically come to the temple or come to Jerusalem. And when he does, the whole world will bow down and say, "Oh, wow, the Jews were right, and God is with you." And all the governments in the world, all the nations, will give over control of their government, their money, and their military to a Davidic monarchy ruled from Jerusalem. And that the whole world will basically bow down to this Messiah figure, and that through him, like through this whole system, the Jews will basically be like a priestly caste to the nations who are basically like taking the word of God and like uh you know teaching it to all the people of the planet as they all worship the God of Zion. Okay? So your question is how does this relate to Christianity? Well, what Christianity does is Christianity fulfills that requirement. So what Christianity has done is Jesus, the character that we don't believe really existed historically, basically fulfills a bunch of these prophecies where whoever's talking, can you mute, please? I think it's primordial. Thanks. So he basically takes these prophecies that we're talking about and he fulfills them. And how does he do that? Well, how else is the pagan world, the whole world, supposed to know about the Messiah, the end times, the prophecies of Isaiah and Daniel and Zechariah and Ezekiel and all these other stories? How else would that ever come to fruition without Islam and Christianity? You understand that through Christianity and Islam, they have spread the concept of a Messiah. They've spread the Torah. They've spread the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob throughout the Middle East and Africa, all the way through North America, South America, Europe, right? Basically, all of the world is following one of these religions to some degree. And there's things like the Taiping Rebellion in China, where they tried to basically like institute an Abrahamic like system, a version of Christianity, a Chinese Christianity. It was like the third bloodiest war in history. Japan was like, the Protestants and the Portuguese and the Dutch and like all these guys, like all the English, like everyone's like fighting over Christianizing Japan. So the whole history of the last 2,000 years since we've gotten this Jewish story about the Jewish Messiah has basically been the fulfillment of the Jewish prophecies. And those Jewish prophecies, as we can look at geopolitics today, they're doing it. They're running this as a playbook, they're running it as a script. The whole world can kind of see how these puzzle pieces or how these pieces on the board are coming together to form this like greater Israel God promised this to us situation that we're all dealing with. So part of what we do in here is that we believe that we're a bunch of white guys who are pro-white. We're a bunch of pro-white guys who have come to the conclusion, and we're looking back at what how did white people get here? How did we get in such a bad state? And we're thinking to ourselves, we're looking at ourselves honestly, and we see that basically part of this serious problem is Christianity, and the fact that look, like Jews are running the show right now. And how did they get there? Well, the answer is once again Christianity. And how and where did this come out of? Well, it's another story that came out of Judea. It's another thing that Jews are involved with. And in these spaces, we just kind of like talk about this. We talk about the historicity. Did Jesus exist? And like, is this a good thing for our people to continue kind of like having a relationship with? Because to us, if we keep having a relationship with Christianity, it's just gonna the whole world's gonna be brown. The whole world's gonna be Brazil. We have no like justification for ourselves as a people as long as we remain in a universalist religion, which is Christianity. And Christianity, like just to wrap it up, is was basically like started entirely by ethnic Jews, right? So all the first Christians, second generation Christians were started by ethnic Jews. And just because our people have had like a relationship with it since that began does not mean we need to continue this like sunken cost fallacy, this multi-generational sunken cost fallacy. So we see ourselves as kind of like one of the first generations of white people, Europeans, who are able to really like push back and fight against this, because for almost all of our history, anyone talking badly about Christianity would be shunned and kicked out of their community, beheaded. I mean, this is what wars were fought over in Europe for hundreds of years, right? So that's kind of how we see this whole thing and why it's so important that Jesus is like a Jewish psyop.